The sea has always been an old friend to me, the kind of friend who doesn't speak much, just listens. It's comforting, really, when the world on land gets too noisy, too cluttered. But that day, I felt something different, something off. The sea seemed quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was out on my boat, the Wandering Star, just a few miles off the coast of Maine. It was late afternoon, the sky painted with strokes of orange and pink as the sun began its slow descent. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so, like a mirror reflecting the sky above. The kind of calm that would normally make a fisherman like me grateful, but instead, it set my nerves on edge. I'd been pulling in my nets, expecting the usual haul of cod and haddock, when I saw it, a flicker beneath the surface, something that caught the last rays of the setting sun. At first, I thought it was just a school of fish, maybe a few mackerel breaking the surface. But as I leaned over the side to get a better look, I realized this was no fish. It was like a shard of glass, shimmering in the water, refracting light in a way that didn't make sense. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost as if it was aware of me watching. My heart started to pound, a dull thud against my ribs. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was beautiful, in a way, mesmerizing even, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand hovering just above the water. The thing shimmered brighter, and before I could pull back, a beam of light shot out from it, wrapping around my wrist like a vice. There was no time to react, no time to scream. The light pulled me overboard with a force that knocked the wind out of me, dragging me down into the icy depths. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut. It was all-consuming, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes you forget the warmth of the sun. I tried to fight it, kicking and thrashing, but the light only tightened its grip, pulling me deeper and deeper. The surface disappeared, swallowed by the dark water, and I was left alone in the abyss. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light released me, and I floated, suspended in the water, dazed and disoriented. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I struggled to figure out which way was up, which way led to the air that I so desperately needed. But before I could even attempt to swim, I realized something was wrong. I wasn't sinking, nor was I floating back up to the surface. I was just still, suspended in the water like a fly caught in amber. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but there was nothing, just the endless black of the deep sea. And then I saw them. They emerged from the darkness, at first just faint glimmers like stars in the night sky. But as they drew closer, I could make out their shapes. Tall, slender figures with skin that seemed to glow from within, a soft, eerie luminescence that barely cut through the dark. Their eyes, God, their eyes, were the only thing I could focus on. Large, round, and glowing with a pale light, they looked like they were peering straight into my soul. The instant I saw the shimmering figure rise from the water, a cold, primal fear gripped me. It wasn't the usual fear of storms or sharks. This was something different, something unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the glowing shape move with eerie grace, breaking the surface with no sound, no disturbance to the water except the slight ripple spreading out in slow waves. Panic surged. I pulled myself back into the ship using the safety side railings to allow for immediate boarding if one were to fall overboard. Soaking wet, I bolted for the wheelhouse, slamming the door shut and locking it with chattering teeth. I could feel the weight of their presence outside, like a pressure building in the air. My mind raced, desperate for a solution, for some way to fight back. I grabbed the radio, my fingers fumbling as I twisted the dial to the emergency frequency. Mayday! This is the Wandering Star. I'm under attack by something. I need help now. Coordinates, my voice was high-pitched, frantic. But before I could finish, the radio crackled and died, replaced by a high-pitched whine that stabbed through my ears. I twisted the dial in desperation, but the signal was gone, blocked by whatever was out there. A low, resonant hum filled the wheelhouse, vibrating through the walls and floor. It wasn't a sound from the boat's engine or the sea. It was coming from them, from the creatures. The sound made my teeth ache, and I knew I had to act quickly. My eyes darted to the flare gun mounted on the wall. I snatched it up as I loaded a flare. The hum grew louder, the walls of the wheelhouse seeming to pulse with it. I could hear movement outside, soft, almost hesitant footsteps. My breath hitched as a shadow passed by the window, followed by another. They were surrounding the wheelhouse. Without waiting another second, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a deafening bang, crashing through the window and streaking into the dark. The light burst into the night, illuminating the deck with a harsh red glow. In that brief flash, I saw them. Tall, slender figures with glowing eyes, their skin shimmering like wet glass. The flare seemed to confuse them. They recoiled, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. For a moment, I thought I had a chance. I turned toward the gun locker, ready to grab my rifle, but the hum outside intensified, shaking the wheelhouse. The door rattled violently, and I knew I didn't have much time. Desperate, I looked around and spotted the service hatch in the floor. Without a second thought, I yanked it open and scrambled down into the engine room, the hatch slamming shut above me just as I heard the door to the wheelhouse burst open. I could feel the thumping of my heartbeat in my throat as I crouched in the dim, cramped space, the smell of diesel fuel and oil thick in the air. I could hear them moving above me, their footsteps slow and deliberate as they explored the wheelhouse. My hand clutched the cycle button on the diesel motor, ready to do something, anything, to fight back. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft scraping sound like nails on metal. I peered through a gap in the machinery and saw one of them, a long, spindly arm reaching down into the engine room. Its skin was gray and glossy, almost translucent in the dim light. The arm stretched impossibly far, reaching down toward the diesel motor as if searching for something. The alien's hand, if you could call it that, began to probe the gears of the motor. I watched, frozen, as it stuck its slender fingers into the machinery, twisting and turning them in ways that made my stomach churn. Suddenly, rage overtook my fear. I slammed my hand down on the cycle button for the engine. The engine roared to life, and the gears began to turn. A shrill, inhuman scream echoed through the engine room, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. The creature's arm was caught in the gears, and it writhed and thrashed, trying to free itself. Dark blood splattered everywhere. It bled. That meant it was still vulnerable. Seizing the moment, I grabbed a nearby can of kerosene, as I unscrewed the cap. Without thinking, I tipped it over, dousing the engine room in the flammable liquid. The fumes stung my eyes, but I didn't care. I fumbled for a match, striking it against the side of the can. The tiny flame flickered in the dim light, and I threw it onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The flames roared to life, engulfing the engine room in seconds. I could make out the creature's outline in the fire, screaming in pain as the intense blaze began searing into its flesh. I grabbed the rapid inflatable lifeboat stashed in the corner, my heart racing as I scrambled up the ladder and burst through the service hatch. The wheelhouse was filled with smoke and fire, the flames licking at the walls, but I could see them, the aliens, moving through the smoke, their eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. I didn't stop. I charged through the wheelhouse, the heat singeing my clothes, and ran out onto the deck. With do or die, I tossed the lifeboat into the water, watching as it rapidly inflated. The flames were spreading, consuming the wandering star, but I didn't care. I had to get off this boat, away from them. I turned, ready to dive into the water, but as I moved, something stopped me cold. The world around me shimmered, and I felt a strange, surreal sensation, like I was moving through thick water. The fiery deck, the inflated lifeboat, the cold night air, all of it faded, replaced by a dark, oppressive silence. I looked down and saw my hands frozen in place, inches from the edge of the boat. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. None of it had been real. The flare, the fire, the escape. It had all been a waking dream, a desperate fantasy playing out in my mind while my body stood motionless, paralyzed by that first touch of the alien's gaze. I never made it to the lifeboat. I never had a chance to escape. The wheelhouse, the fire, the entire scene had been an illusion, a cruel trick of the mind while the aliens stood right there watching me the whole time. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could do was stare blankly ahead as they closed in, their glowing eyes boring into me, stripping away the last vestiges of hope. And then, just as my mind began to fray, everything went dark. I tried to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own skin. The figures surrounded me, their eyes studying me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. They weren't human. That much was clear. Their bodies were too long, too thin, joints bending in ways that didn't seem natural. And their faces, I can't even begin to describe them. They were both beautiful and horrifying, like something out of a nightmare you can't wake up from. They didn't speak, not with words anyway, but I could feel them in my head, their thoughts brushing against my mind like whispers in the dark. It was like they were talking to each other, debating what to do with me. I wanted to beg them to let me go, to leave me alone, but the words were trapped in my throat. Suddenly, one of them reached out, its hand, or what I assumed was its hand, touching my chest. It felt like fire and ice at the same time, a sensation that spread through my entire body. And then everything went white. When I came to, I was no longer in the water. I was floating inside a chamber, a translucent cocoon filled with a thick, viscous liquid that clung to my skin like a second layer. I tried to move, but it was like trying to swim through honey, every motion slow and laborious. The walls of the chamber were clear, and beyond them, I could see the figures moving about, their eyes still locked onto me. Panic set in. I thrashed against the liquid, trying to break free, but it was no use. My movements only seemed to amuse them, their eyes narrowing as if they were smiling at my futile attempts. I felt like a specimen, trapped in a jar, helpless and alone. I don't know how long I was in that chamber. Time lost all meaning. It could have been hours or it could have been days. All I know is that I never once stopped feeling those eyes on me, watching, analyzing, as if I was nothing more than a curiosity to them. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The liquid drained away, and the chamber opened with a hiss. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my limbs heavy and uncooperative. The figures didn't try to stop me as I crawled forward, desperate to put as much distance between them and me as possible. But there was nowhere to go. The room I found myself in was small and featureless, the walls smooth and seamless, with no visible exits. I don't know what they did to me while I was in that chamber, but I could feel it. Something had changed. There was a buzzing in the back of my mind, a constant hum that I couldn't shake. It was like a radio tuned to a frequency just out of range, a sound that was both there and not there at the same time. The figures didn't follow me when I collapsed in the corner of the room, my back against the wall. They just watched, their eyes never leaving me. I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg them to let me go, but all I could do was stare back, too exhausted to even move. That's when I noticed the change. The hum in my head was growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a pressure building in my skull, threatening to split it open. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but it only got worse. The pain was unbearable, like a vice tightening around my brain. The first incision was made without warning, a sharp blade of light that sliced through the skin of my abdomen with impossible ease. There was no pain. Whatever they had done to me had dulled all physical sensation. But I could feel the pressure, the sickening tug as they peeled back the layers of flesh. The sight of my own insides, exposed and vulnerable, reflected in the metal above, made my stomach churn. One of the aliens reached into the open cavity, its fingers impossibly long and slender, moving with a grace that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. I watched in helpless terror as it delicately lifted my organs, examining them with a curiosity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't long before they began their modifications. A needle-like instrument, glinting with a faint blue light, was inserted into my stomach. The alien carefully guided it through my flesh, threading it between my intestines with meticulous care. I could see, reflected in the metal, how the needle left behind a thin silver filament that glowed faintly, snaking its way through my innards like some parasitic worm. I could only guess at its purpose, but the sight alone was enough to make me want to vomit, if only I could. The alien worked swiftly, attaching the filament to various points inside my body, connecting it to nerves and blood vessels with a precision that defied understanding. I could feel a strange tingling as it moved, as if the filament was somehow integrating itself with my nervous system, becoming a part of me. Then, without any warning, they moved on to my chest. Another incision, another section of flesh pulled away, revealing the steady rhythm of my heart. The reflection in the metal above showed every grotesque detail. The pulsing of my veins, the slick sheen of blood as it pooled around the incision. My breath hitched as one of the aliens reached inside, its hand closing around my heart with a gentleness that seemed almost mocking. It held my heart in its grasp, and I could see it applying pressure at specific points, manipulating the organ with an almost tender care. Another instrument was brought forth, this one resembling a small, circular saw, its blade rotating silently. The alien positioned it above my heart and made a series of precise cuts, opening small holes in the muscular tissue. Into these holes, it inserted tiny metal devices, each no larger than a grain of rice. These implants fused with my heart almost instantly, their metallic surfaces melting into the flesh as if they were one and the same. The sight was horrific, like watching some monstrous clockwork being assembled inside my own body. I could see the implants beginning to pulse in time with my heartbeat, their glow intensifying with each beat. Whatever these devices were, they were now a part of me, integrated into the very core of my being. The alien released my heart, allowing it to settle back into place, the incision sealing itself almost immediately, as if it had never been there. But the modifications didn't stop there. Another incision was made, this time along my forearm. I watched in sickened fascination as they carefully peeled back the skin, exposing the muscles and tendons beneath. They inserted a thin metallic rod along the length of my arm, threading it between the bones with an unnatural ease. The rod extended from my wrist to my elbow, and as it was implanted, I felt a strange buzzing sensation, as if it was vibrating at a frequency just beyond my perception. They continued this process up and down my body, each modification more grotesque and invasive than the last. My legs, my spine, even my skull, nothing was spared. I could see, reflected in that cursed metal above, how they had opened my skull with a series of sharp, precise cuts. The top of my head was lifted away, like the lid of a jar, revealing the soft, pulsating mass of my brain. The sight was nauseating. My own brain laid bare, its folds and crevices glistening under the harsh lights. The aliens moved with a terrifying purpose, inserting tiny spider-like devices into the folds of my brain. Each one crawled across the surface, burrowing into the gray matter with a sickening slurp. I could feel them inside my head, their tiny legs scraping against my thoughts, probing and rewiring my mind. I watched, horrified, as one of the aliens inserted a long, thin probe into the base of my skull, threading it down into my spinal column. The probe began to hum, sending vibrations through my entire body. My muscles spasmed uncontrollably, and I could feel the probe interfacing with my nervous system, overriding my natural impulses, bending my will to their command. And then they began to test their work. I saw them reach out with a claw-like device, gripping one of the implanted rods in my arm. The rod hummed to life, and I watched in horror as my arm moved on its own, bending and flexing at their command. My hand curled into a fist, then opened again, the movement smooth and mechanical, completely outside my control. I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything, but my body was no longer my own. It was a puppet, and they were pulling the strings. The reflection in the metal above was a nightmare. My body, my mind, twisted and mutilated beyond recognition. The implants glowed faintly under my skin, a network of alien technology fused with my flesh, controlling my every thought, my every movement. I could feel them inside me, those tiny crawling machines, burrowing deeper, taking over. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was one of the aliens leaning over me, its glowing eyes reflecting in the overhead metal. It stared into my soul, its expression unreadable, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I was no longer human. I was theirs, and just like that, I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The wheelhouse was quiet, except for the frantic screeching of a seagull just outside the window. Its beady eyes stared in at me, wings flapping wildly against the glass, as if it were trying to shake me from the nightmare. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, the vivid terror of that dream still clinging to my thoughts. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing heavily, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. Slowly, reality began to settle back in. I was on the wandering star, safe and sound. No aliens, no burning boat, no twisted experiments. Just me, the open sea, and the familiar creak of the old ship rocking gently beneath me. I glanced over at the GPS, and my stomach did a little flip. According to the screen, I was just a few miles from where the abduction had occurred in my dream. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The coordinates were too close for comfort, too eerily similar to the scene I'd just imagined. The seagull let out another piercing cry, snapping me out of my thoughts. I turned to look at it, my heart still racing, and for some reason, a strange sense of gratitude washed over me. Fishermen often say seagulls are the souls of dead fishermen, watching over the living. I'd always thought it was just a superstition, something old-timers said to pass the time. But now, staring at that bird, I couldn't help but wonder. Maybe it had saved my life. Without another thought, I turned the wheel, pointing the wandering star back toward port. The idea of staying out here any longer made my skin crawl. The storm I'd dreamt of might not be real, but something about this place felt wrong. I wasn't about to tempt fate. As the boat slowly made its way back to the safety of the harbor, I kept glancing back at that seagull, which had perched itself on the railing, watching me with its dark, knowing eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a bird, that it had been sent to wake me up, to warn me before something truly terrible happened. By the time the lights of the harbor came into view, the tension in my chest began to ease. The seagull let out one final cry before taking off, disappearing into the darkening sky. I watched it go, feeling a strange mix of relief and wonder. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was something more. But one thing was certain. I was alive, and I was heading home. And as I sailed back into port, I couldn't help but think that, just maybe, the souls of the lost really were keeping an eye on me.